Last month, President Trump targeted the Smithsonian Institution, one of the country's most prominent arts and culture institutions, in his attempt to rewrite American history. He signed an executive order that calls on Vice President J.D. Vance to, quote, remove improper ideology from all areas of the institution. One museum at particular risk under the order is the National Museum of African American History and Culture that opened in September of 2016. In a piece this week in The Atlantic magazine, the historian and author Clint Smith revisited the museum to take stock of the aspects of American history it conveys. Smith writes, "The National Museum of African American History and Culture is not a place that traffics in improper ideology. It is a museum that recognizes that America has been suffused with improper ideologies for most of its history. Ideologies that ignore the centrality of slavery to the nation's foundings. Ideologies that tell us the Civil War was simply about states' rights. Ideologies that call Reconstruction a failure rather than a campaign that was actively destroyed. Ideologies that excise the important role of queer and female activists during the civil rights movements. Ideologies that ignore the connections between racism and incarceration. Ideologies that tell Americans that the contemporary landscape of inequality in this country has nothing to do with history and is simply a result of who has worked hard and who has not." And as the Trump administration tries to shut down places that explore history, Jim Crow and the legacy of slavery are at the center of a top-grossing film. Sinners from director Ryan Coogler is about twins, both played by the actor Michael B. Jordan, who returned to their hometown in the Mississippi Delta to open a juke joint at the height of Jim Crow segregation in 1932. Joining me now to discuss American history and the attempts to erase it are Clint Smith, the author of that Atlantic piece and also the author of a wonderful book called Now It Can Be Told, and Professor Stephanie Dunn, chair of the Cinema, Television, and Emerging Media Studies Department at Morehouse College. Welcome to both of you. Clint, you also write in that piece, you're speaking of the things that we see on display at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, that these are empirical facts, not ideological ones. And as more Americans have come to understand this history, they have appropriately begun to question much of what they have been taught about America. The team that's trying to determine what ideology is improper and what is proper, is that one of the reasons that they're going after this, is because Americans are getting a fuller picture and they're starting to question what they've learned?
Absolutely. I think that's central to why they are doing what they're doing. Part of what happens is when you begin to tell a new story about America, a story that is more complicated, a story that recognizes, for example, that Thomas Jefferson is not simply the intellectual founding father of this country, but is instead someone who enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. Is that you have to tell a different story about Jefferson. And then when you have to tell a different story about Jefferson, you have to tell a different story about the founding of America. And when you have to tell a different story about the founding of America, you have to tell a different story about the country itself. And what the thing for so many Americans, specifically so many white Americans, is that their conception of themselves, whether consciously or unconsciously, is deeply entangled in a story they have been told about America. And so when that story begins to unravel, or that story begins to have layers added upon it that complicate that story, that help us recognize that the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is not simply because of the people in those communities, but is instead because of what has been done to those communities or extracted from those communities generation after generation after generation, then it demands that you tell a new story about yourself. And that is a really frightening thing for people. It's a sort of existential crisis to have to tell a new story about this country, meaning you have to tell a new story about yourself. And that's deeply frightening for a lot of people.
Professor Dunn, I'm going to get to you in just a minute, but Clint, it also seems like that could be uplifting. I mean, America is a country that is often defined by revolutions as opposed to evolutions. And the fact that we enjoy the country that we live in today is because people evolved, the country evolved, and you can't fully take stock of or or acknowledge or feel a certain pride about the America that we live in if you don't acknowledge where we have been in the past. And to try to remove that history, to me, seems like it's almost like a form of larceny. Isn't there another way of looking at this that doesn't mean that people have to feel bad about what happened, but maybe can feel a little bit better about where we now and understanding how we have evolved as a country?
I think that's absolutely right. And it's strange because when we think of ourselves, for example, when I think of myself, I don't think of myself as a perfect person. I don't think of myself as someone who has only done good things. I think of myself as someone who tries to do my best every day, but also as someone who's made mistakes. There are things in my life I've done that I'm proud of, and there are things in my life I've done that I'm not so proud of. But I wake up every day and try to be a better version of myself. And America is the same thing. America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their own ancestors could have never imagined, and has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. And in order to understand America, we have to hold both of those realities at once, the same way we hold those realities within us. So it's strange that there are so many people who would suggest that we try to tell a story about America that singularly talks about the things that America should be proud of, rather in a way that we don't even talk about ourselves or our loved ones. We talk about the complexity of who we are. We talk about how we try to become a better version of who we are, how we try to live up to the sort of aspirations and values that we hold for ourselves. And it only seems to make sense to me that we should think about our country in the same way.